I am the practice lead in clinical research here, covering the US and Canada. And I'm here with Dan Mans. He is based in Minneapolis. He's an industry expert, having been almost in the industry for 30 years and has worked for the likes of Abbott and Medtronic. So we're going to be discussing an overview of the medtech market, the unique challenges faced from startups and so on. But first, if you can just give us a brief introduction to yourself, Dan, and we can get started from there.
Sure. Thank you, Shar. It's a pleasure to be part of this experience. So my time, as you say, has been about 30 years in the medical device field, starting in clinical research, taking on regulatory affairs and some other functions, and becoming part of senior management teams about 20 years ago. And in that time, I've worked in a number of therapeutic areas. Primarily, I've been working in cardiology. That, is a broad space. So specifically within structural heart is most of my experience, heart failure, as well as pacing and electrophysiology. In addition to cardiology, I've been in pelvic health, and outside those, I've been involved in spinal orthopedics. So a fairly diverse set of experiences from a therapeutic standpoint. But my focus has always been in clinical affairs, study design, trial execution, trial reporting. And then with respect to regulatory affairs, I've had the opportunity to testify before 2 FDA panels. So primarily in the area of presenting the clinical data, but also as an overall owner of the panel meeting. And happy to say both of those panel meetings received unanimous approval from the panel, or unanimous recommendation that the FDA would approve the devices. So really fortunate to have had that experience, learning from it, and proud to say, what we were able to accomplish.
Fantastic. Essentially, the entire life cycle of the medical device trial that you covered. So yeah, that's great. Exactly. Great. So so just jumping onto our questions then. So what would you say were the biggest challenges medical device companies have faced in last year and also a little bit of this year?
This is not unique to 2023, but you've heard often that startup companies in particular, which is where most of my expertise or experiences come from, will succeed most when they focus. And I don't think that's any great insight, because as a startup, you really need to be your resource poor, right? You really need to make sure you're being efficient with those resources. And so to use them in the right manner is important. So it's not so much that companies in 2023 or always have had a hard time knowing it's important to focus. I think what's been difficult is knowing what to focus on. So and too often we rely on senior leadership or board level intuition about what's important in order to exploit the opportunity, rather than have a real deliberate and thoughtful approach. I have a philosophy about how to do that really is intended to bring concepts that we use in product development to the overall management of the enterprise, because too often all we're doing in startups is focusing on the technology. We're not thinking about anything more than how this device can meet a specification that's been perhaps poorly developed, but developed nonetheless. And it's rare that a startup will fail because the engineering team has failed to meet that specification. It's more common that external challenges, which certainly we faced in 2023, will be unaddressed. We won't understand the real needs of the funders, for example, and understand what their objections might be to our story and how we shore those up, if you will, to identify those as needs and to determine what it will take to meet those needs. We often don't know what the real need of the person we're trying to satisfy is. Let me give an example of that. It's very common for medical device manufacturers, whether we're startups or not, when they're approaching the FDA, to go and ask the question, FDA, we're struggling with this particular standard and how it applies to our device. What do you recommend that we do? And many will say that's the wrong approach. And I don't think it's great insight, again, to say you really shouldn't ask the FDA. You should analyze it yourself and make a proposal and have them respond to it. But beyond that, I think when those that have gone and asked the question have gotten a response from the agency, oftentimes they'll take that response at face value, they'll go and they'll do what the agency said, they'll come back with the data, and the FDA will say, no, 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 that's not what we need. And industry gets very frustrated because we would say, we came to you and we asked, we did what you said, and now you're saying it's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in my opinion, that happens not just in regulatory affairs, but throughout the enterprise, really in all the functional areas. What we failed to do in that particular case is to understand the real question that the real concern that the FDA had.
Mm-hmm.
If we had
Mm-hmm.
understood the real concern, we wouldn't just do the test. We would realize, as the owner of that device or that therapeutic opportunity, what the core question was that the FDA was concerned about, and then be able to
Mm-hmm.
go about addressing it in the way that only we know, how best to address. So that's an example of failing on the part of the management team of the company to understand the important decision maker, in this case FDA, and what their needs would be, and whether or not we have the data or the
Mm-hmm.
wherewithal to address
Yeah.
the need.
That's it. That's really good. What I'd like to actually build on that question is that last year was very, very tricky for biotechs, for lots of different companies that rely on funding from venture capitalists, etc. So
Mhm.
has that had an impact on medical device and medtech companies?
It absolutely has, and I would say over the last decade, not just in the last year. It's always one of the most difficult things for a startup to do, particularly if you're developing a new therapy or a product in a new therapeutic space. And startups often are. That's the reason they're a startup, and the development work isn't being done within already established ongoing concern. The large medtech companies, medical device manufacturers, will oftentimes focus on product line extensions and those kinds of things and do that well. But if it's a really new revolutionary idea, it's difficult to
Mm-hmm.
do within the confines of a large already established organization.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, when you're going to get funding in a new therapeutic area, it's particularly difficult, and the availability of venture funds has become increasingly less and less. I know a lot of funds that I've been working with in the past have indicated that the medical device space is particularly difficult to do well in with their venture investments. They've done their own analysis and said, look, we're more interested in biotech, biopharma, pharmaceutical. We've had to work with fewer venture firms than, say, a decade ago, who recognize or still see the opportunity in medical device.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I know it might be interesting to give an example. I was involved in a company named Tendyne in the structural heart area of cardiology.
Mm-hmm.
We raised a total of $40 million. We spent about 30 million of that 40, and our takeout with milestones was 400 million. So, and that was done over a period of about 5 years. So it's still possible. There's no question.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a technology that was in a huge market space. It was transcatheter mitral valve regurgitation, and fortunately for us, aortic transcatheter aortic valves had such success. There are a lot of interested investors. So the market that size and history of success in a related area that was pretty fresh and recent, uh,
Mm-hmm.
raising capital was not nearly as difficult as it normally is. But I think beyond that, the fact that we were able to raise that money, that wasn't frankly a lot of money, right? We were very efficient in focusing on the right things, so that we were able to go from concept to acquisition in a remarkably short period of time.
And that actually perfectly leads us on to the next question. So it's just about, what are the key trends? What are the breakthrough technologies that you think is
Mm,
shaping the US medtech market at the moment?
yeah, good. So within cardiology, I would say structural heart is very, very big. I mean, it's been a big part of the focus over the last, more than the last year, over the last, say, 5 years, even 10 years, if you go all the way back to aortic But beyond that, there have been some really interesting ideas to deal with the protection of the patient from thromboembolus they have atrial fibrillation using a device rather than a pharmaceutical. Another structural heart area that really came to be over the last decade, and a number of, I would say, fast followers have come and taken up the opportunity once the space was established to create devices as well in that area. Similarly, devices to plug atrial septal defects have also been important for the obvious reasons that patients would previously have surgery to close atrial septal defects. But now there's a realization that perhaps creating a hole within the atrial septum could be valuable and beneficial to certain heart failure patients.
What do you think about artificial intelligence? Because from my perspective, we're seeing a lot of companies that are getting their piece of the puzzle here, and they want to get involved in this. So what do you think of that?
I think it's very interesting. I would say it hasn't been applied much in the mechanical medical device area. I can see how it might be as the field develops. I suspect it's developing, or it's more useful in the short term in some of the research areas where there's enormous amounts of data and it needs to be called through more quickly. The kind of research we're doing in medical devices often less complex than that. The data sets are smaller, and the information is pretty easy to pick through and analyze. One of the things that is difficult for us to do, and I think that we would need more a better understanding probably of factors that would go into the models that I would use initially, is non-responders and responders that are treated in the earliest stages of the clinical evaluation. People will say often, "You got this device, it seems to work really well in some, it doesn't work that well in others, and we can't figure out how to separate responders from non-responders based on their characteristics, so that we can be more careful about who to use this in, or even to understand the mechanisms. Why is it working in this group and not in that group?" So that's an area where there is a large amount of data that could help us, and it's difficult, or that where AI could help us, it's difficult oftentimes for us to understand, other than beyond a fairly simple kind of first degree analysis of the data, if you will. Has there been a number of really terrific successes, both from a therapeutic area as well as from a business perspective in the space. And it's also very broad insofar as it was originally developed to treat things that you would think are obviously treatable with neurostimulation. Spinal, pain in the back, do spinal cord stimulation. Epilepsy, stimulate the brain. I mean, that's pretty, maybe not intuitive, but you can see why electrical stimulation would impact those things. But now it's being used much more broadly. There are a lot of nerves in the body that do a lot of things. So vagal nerve stimulation has been used from depression to heart failure. They're still
Alzheimer's, possibly CNS as well. Alzheimer's,
right.
That's becoming one of the more popular therapeutic areas. It's so topical.
We often try and say, it's one thing to develop a device that has capabilities of changing the neurostimulation parameters, but knowing how to change them and understanding what the impact is on the patient's physiology is far more complex than simply developing the device. Or you can imagine with even 5 or 6 settings, the number of combinations, particularly when you have continuous variability around amplitude, for example. It's not just high or low, it's from 0 volts to 2 volts. So everywhere throughout that range, there might be a different impact to the nerve and different fibers within the nerve. And so it gets very complex very quickly. And that's where I can see, again, AI. And I don't understand much about AI. I think that's probably true for a lot of people. But conceptually, I think in terms of sorting through a lot of information, AI could help us in that area as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So on to the next question then. So can you think of any specific examples of successful medical devices or med tech even that you think will become popular in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I would say beyond what I have already said with respect to the structural heart example in Tendyne, there have been others. There's Inspire is a sleep apnea company, and there's another company called Nyxoah that's going after that space. Inspire has been very successful in terms of their ability to develop a therapy. So people that sleep apnea is a very, very prevalent disease. So again, funding for that, is a bit easier because everybody can understand the opportunity that exists with a large number of patients who suffer from it. And it really didn't have an adequate solution in the CPAP machines. Oftentimes were very difficult to tolerate for the patients. So many of those people were looking for a new solution. So the need obvious, it was real. Inspire went out, they had their approval relatively quickly, and then they were able to do a private or a public offering and have performed really, really well since then.
Fantastic.
Okay.
So that's a company to watch then.
Yeah, and there have been other neuromodulation therapies and other structural heart companies as well. I mentioned the left atrial appendage occlusion device within the review of opportunities in structural heart. There was a company that unfortunately had a very long path to approval. It was the first company with that therapy, but once it had approval, it's been very successful in the medical community and from a financial standpoint as well for for the startup investors as well as for, I think the acquirer is quite happy that they purchased that technology.
Fantastic. What would you say your predictions are for the future of the med device market and the key focus areas?
Perhaps medical device therapies that we would pursue, previously will be addressed now with more biologically oriented solutions. I remember when I was at Medtronic, one of our luminaries there, a Bakken Fellow, for those of you out there who understand the kind of highest award for the technical contributors in the company, said, I don't think that mechanical solutions or implantable devices are the future. I think that we're going to see things like stem cell therapies and so forth actually repair the tissues or the physiology that we're trying to treat with alternative methods, with mechanical implants. So yeah, I still think that there's opportunity. I remember thinking 30 years ago, when we're done with projects run now, what else will we do? But the longer I'm in the space, the more I see that there are opportunities that continue to emerge as creative people look to improving the treatment of patients with various diseases.
It's interesting that you say that because both a medical device and a drug that can be used to treat a symptom or a disease, each of them have their own pros and cons. One would be the stem cell therapy, gene therapy. It requires a lot of money and it's very expensive. Whereas with a medical device trials, it requires less money. The FDA challenges are less rigid than it would be for a drug development trial. So there's pros and cons, I would say, and I think there's still a lot of potential in the industry if it's done correctly. Because we've got some giants in the market, such as Boston Scientific, Stryker, and they've been around for a very long time. So I think it's an interesting take.
And it can be difficult for those folks who have been around a long time to be creative. I spent some time at Medtronic. My last assignment there was in a group that we called New Indications initially. And then it became clear that the new indications, if you will, that we were pursuing were almost all in heart failure. So, which is another space, by the way, that involves a structural heart can support, but heart failure beyond structural heart is a very, very interesting space. Neurostim for heart failure, mechanical devices for heart failure. But what I would say is that as much as we might believe that biotech is going to take place of some of the medical devices, because as you implied, we're not fixing the disease when we put a medical device in. Typically, we're treating a symptom, or we're
Correct.
minimizing the impact of the disease. But I will say, it's very defined what we're doing with a medical device. With drug, you have to understand that while you're targeting this particular receptor on a cell, for example, that may impact unintended receptors or similar receptors on other cells throughout the body. So your impact of a pharmaceutical agent is less well contained, if you will, and therefore requires a lot
Correct.
more in terms of clinical research and so forth. I remember working in spinal orthopedics when bone morphogenic protein, or BMP, first started to be used to increase the effectiveness of spinal fusion. And there were some real concerns, and in fact, were some experiences where this protein created too much bone growth and actually became a problem for the patient.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for your answers to the questions and your time today. I think we got a really good overview of what's happening in the medical device market and what might happen in the future. So yeah, thanks
Great.
again, and then until next time, I suppose.
Very good. And thanks for the opportunity. Of course, it's fun to talk about our space.